On a cold morning in October of 1972, in Franklin County, Nebraska, a 28-year-old farmer named Paul Einhorn buried his father in the family cemetery behind the farmhouse. Herman Einhorn was 67 years old when his heart gave out. He'd been a quiet man, a farmer who worked his land, paid his debts, and never talked much about himself or his past. Paul had grown up on that farm, worked beside his father since he was old enough to hold a wrench, and yet there were parts of Herman's life that remained mysterious even to his only son. The funeral was small. Herman had outlived most of his friends, and he'd never been the type to cultivate social connections. A few neighbors came. The Methodist minister said some words, and then Paul stood alone at the grave while everyone else drove away. He was 28 years old, unmarried, and now the sole owner of 200 acres of Nebraska farmland. It should have been the beginning of his adult life as a real farmer, finally stepping out from his father's shadow. Instead, it was the beginning of something else entirely. Let me tell you about the toolbox, because that's where this story really starts. A week after the funeral, Paul was cleaning out his father's workshop. The old man had accumulated 50 years of tools, parts, and equipment, most of it organized in ways that only Herman understood. Paul was sorting through it all, deciding what to keep and what to sell, when he came across a metal toolbox he'd never seen his father open. It was old, older than Paul, older maybe than his father's time on the farm. The metal was rusted at the corners, and the latch was stiff from decades of disuse. Paul had to use a screwdriver to pry it open. Inside, he found what he expected: old wrenches, a handful of bolts and screws, some rusted drill bits, the detritus of a working life, nothing special. But beneath the tools, at the very bottom of the box, was something else, a piece of paper, yellowed with age and folded into quarters. Paul unfolded it carefully, afraid it might crumble in his hands. What he found made him sit down heavily on his father's workbench. It was a map, hand-drawn, in ink that had faded to brown. It showed the Einhorn farm in careful detail. The house, the barn, the property lines, the creek that ran along the eastern boundary, all of it rendered in his father's precise handwriting. And in the north pasture, near the old fence line, there was an X. Below the X, in the same faded ink, were words: 1943, only when you truly need it. Paul stared at the map for a long time. His father had drawn this in 1943, 29 years ago, when Herman was 38 years old and Paul wasn't even born yet. What had his father buried in that pasture? Why had he never mentioned it? Why leave a map instead of just telling his son what was there? The questions multiplied the longer Paul looked at the yellowed paper. Finally, he folded the map, put it in his pocket, and went to find some answers. Now let me tell you about the John Deere dealer, because this is where Paul made his first mistake. The dealer's name was Lyle Drucker, and he'd sold equipment in Franklin County for 20 years. He knew everyone, heard everything, and had opinions about all of it. Paul had known Lyle his whole life, had bought parts from him, listened to his advice, trusted his judgment on matters of farming and machinery. So when Paul walked into Drucker Equipment 3 days after finding the map, he thought he was consulting a friend. "Lyle, I found something in my father's things." "A map." Lyle looked up from his desk. "A map of what?" Paul unfolded the paper and showed him. "Of our farm. My father drew it in 19... There's a spot marked in the north pasture." Lyle studied the map, then looked at Paul with an expression that slowly shifted from curiosity to amusement. "Paul, are you telling me you think your father buried treasure on your farm?" "I don't know what he buried. That's why I'm asking." "You're asking me." Lyle started to laugh. "Paul, I sell tractors. I don't interpret treasure maps." The laughter grew louder. "Buried treasure, like a pirate story. Oh, that's rich." Paul felt his face flush. "My father wrote only when you truly need it." He must have meant something. He meant he was getting old and sentimental. Probably. Lyle wiped his eyes, still chuckling. "Look, Paul, Your father was a good man, but he was also a bit odd. You know that. He probably drew this map as a joke, or forgot about it, or who knows what. But what if? What if there's a pot of gold buried in your pasture? Lyle shook his head. Paul, you're 28 years old. You're not a child anymore. Your father left you a farm. A real farm, worth real money. Focus on that instead of digging holes looking for fairy tales. Paul folded the map and put it back in his pocket. Thanks for the advice, Lyle. Anytime. Lyle was still smiling as Paul walked out. Hey, if you find a leprechaun out there, let me know. The laughter followed Paul out the door. By that evening, the story had spread through half the county. Let me tell you about the mockery, because that's what Paul lived with for the next 3 years. Within a week, everyone in Franklin County knew about Paul Einhorn and his treasure map. Lyle had told the story at the feed store, at the diner, at church, anywhere people would listen. And people loved to listen. Did you hear? Paul Einhorn thinks his daddy buried treasure in the back 40. Treasure? Like gold doubloons? Who knows? He's got a map and everything. X marks the spot. The laughter was constant. People called him Treasure Hunter Paul, or Pirate Paul, or just the Einhorn boy with the map. They asked if he'd found any doubloons yet. They suggested he buy a metal detector. They wondered aloud if maybe Herman Einhorn had lost his mind before he died. Paul's first instinct was to put the map away and forget about it. The humiliation was intense, and a part of him wondered if Lyle was right, if his father really had just been confused or sentimental, or playing some kind of joke. But something stopped him. It was the handwriting on the map, that careful, precise lettering that Paul had seen on hundreds of documents over the years, feed orders, equipment manuals, letters to suppliers. His father never joked. His father never did anything without a reason. If Herman Einhorn drew a map and marked a spot and wrote only when you truly need it, then Herman Einhorn meant exactly that. Paul started digging in the spring of 19... Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever believed in something that everyone else thought was crazy? Have you ever kept going when the whole world was laughing at you? That's what Paul Einhorn faced. Every morning he got up, did his farm work, and then spent his evenings digging in the north pasture. Every week, someone made a joke about his treasure hunt. Every month, he found nothing. But he kept digging. Let me tell you about the digging, because that's where Paul's character showed itself. The spot marked on the map was in the north pasture, near an old fence line that hadn't been used since Paul's grandfather's time. The ground there was hard. Decades of grass and roots had compacted the soil into something that felt more like concrete than dirt. Paul started with a shovel. When that proved too slow, he borrowed a post hole digger. When that broke, he bought another one. He dug in the evenings after his farm work was done, sometimes by lantern light when the days grew short. The hole got deeper. 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet, nothing. His neighbors drove by and watched him dig. Some stopped to offer advice. Paul, you're wasting your time. There's nothing down there, son. Your father would be ashamed to see you like this. Paul kept digging. His wife Martha, they'd married in the summer of 1973, 6 months after he started, stood by him even when her own family questioned her judgment. Martha, you married a crazy man. He spends every night digging holes. He's not crazy, Martha would say. He's determined. There's a difference. The difference is crazy people don't know when to quit. Martha had no answer for that, but she brought Paul sandwiches while he dug, and she never asked him to stop. Let me tell you about the doubts, because Paul had them too. By the fall of 1974, 2 years after he found the map, Paul had dug a hole nearly 5 feet deep and 6 feet wide. He'd moved tons of Nebraska soil. He'd broken 3 shovels, 2 post-hole diggers, and a pickaxe. He'd endured 2 years of mockery, 2 years of jokes, 2 years of watching his neighbors smirk every time they saw him. And he'd found nothing. One night, after another fruitless evening of digging, Paul sat on the edge of the hole and looked at the map by lantern light. The X was still there, mocking him. The words were still there. Only when you truly need it. What did you bury, Dad? Paul whispered to the darkness. "Why didn't you just tell me?" There was no answer. There was never an answer. Paul folded the map and put it in his pocket. He picked up his shovel. He climbed back into the hole, and he kept digging. Let me tell you about Martha, because she was part of this story too. Martha Einhorn, née Patterson, had grown up on a farm 3 miles from the Einhorn place. She'd known Paul since childhood, had watched him work beside his father, had seen the way he treated animals and equipment and land. She knew he was quiet, like Herman. She knew he was stubborn, like Herman. And she knew he was honest in a way that most men weren't. When Paul showed her the map, 3 months into their marriage, she didn't laugh. "What do you think it is?" she asked. "I don't know. Money, maybe, or documents, something valuable." "And you believe it's really there?" Paul looked at her. "My father never lied to me. Not once, in 28 years. If he drew this map, there's something at that spot. I just have to find it." Martha nodded. "Then we'll find it." She never questioned him after that. When neighbors made jokes, she defended him. When his own cousins suggested he might need professional help, she told them to mind their own business. When the hole reached 5 feet deep and still showed nothing, she brought him coffee and sat with him while he rested. "Everyone thinks I'm crazy," Paul said one night. "Everyone thought Noah was crazy too," Martha replied, "until it started raining." Paul smiled. It was the first time he'd smiled in weeks. "I love you," he said. "I know. Now finish your coffee and keep digging." Now let me tell you about the morning of April 12, 1975, because that's when everything changed. Paul had been digging for 2.5 years. The hole was now 6 feet deep, deeper than a grave, and the sides had to be shored up with boards to keep them from collapsing. He'd expanded the width twice, following a hunch that maybe he'd miscalculated the exact position of the X. That morning, he climbed down into the hole before sunrise, planning to dig for an hour before starting his regular farm work. The soil at this depth was different, harder, with streaks of clay that made every shovelful a struggle. He'd been digging for maybe 20 minutes when his shovel hit something that wasn't dirt. The sound was different, metal on metal, with a hollow ring that echoed up from the bottom of the hole. Paul's heart stopped. Then it started again, pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He dropped to his knees and started clearing the dirt with his hands, not trusting the shovel to be gentle enough. The clay was stubborn, clinging to whatever was beneath it, but Paul scraped and dug and pulled until he could see it. A metal box, rusted, corroded, about the size of a large shoebox, but unmistakably a metal box, buried 6 feet deep in the spot his father had marked 32 years earlier. Paul sat back on his heels, covered in dirt, tears streaming down his face. "Martha!" he shouted. "Martha!" She came running from the house, still in her nightgown, and found her husband kneeling in a hole in the pasture, cradling a rusted metal box like it was a newborn child. "You found it," she breathed. "I found it. They didn't open it in the field." Paul wanted to. His hands were shaking with the need to know what was inside. But Martha insisted they bring it to the house, clean it off, do this properly. This was the treasure his father had left him. It deserved respect. They carried it to the kitchen table, and Paul pried off the rusted lid with a screwdriver. Inside was an envelope sealed with wax that had long since crumbled. Inside the envelope was a letter, written in Herman Einhorn's careful hand. Paul read it aloud, his voice breaking on every other word. "My dear son, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found what I left for you. I buried this box in April of 1943, during the darkest days of the war, when I feared that the banks might fail, and the government might collapse, and everything we had worked for might be taken away. Inside this box you will find 2 things. The first is $12,000 in cash. My entire savings accumulated over 15 years of farming. In 1943, I did not trust the banks to keep it safe. I trust the earth more than I trust institutions. The second is more valuable than the money. It is the deed to the 80 acres north of our property, the land that belonged to my father before the bank took it in 19... I never told you about this box because I hoped you would never need it. I hoped the world would be kind enough that you could live your life without buried treasure. But if you are reading this letter, then the world was not kind, and you needed what I left. Use it wisely, my son. Buy no debt, trust no banker, and remember that the earth keeps its secrets better than any vault. Your father, Herman Einhorn, April 17, 1943. Paul set down the letter and looked at what else was in the box. Bundles of cash, old bills from the 1940s wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture. He counted them twice, $12,000 exactly, and beneath the cash, a deed. Yellowed, fragile, but unmistakably legal. A transfer of 80 acres from one Ernst Kaufmann to Herman Einhorn, dated March 3rd. 80 acres that Paul hadn't known existed. 80 acres that belonged to his family, waiting all these years to be claimed. Paul looked at Martha. Martha looked at Paul. "We need to go to the bank," she said. "First we need to go see Lyle Drucker. Let me tell you about the John Deere dealership, because Paul Einhorn had something to show them." When Paul walked into Drucker Equipment that afternoon, carrying a metal box under his arm, every head in the place turned to look at him. Lyle was at his desk, going over paperwork, and he looked up with that familiar smirk already forming on his face. Well, treasure hunter Paul, did you find your gold doubloons?" Paul set the metal box on Lyle's desk. He opened it. Lyle's smirk disappeared. What is that?" "That's $12,000 in cash." Paul's voice was calm, steady. "My father buried it along with a deed to 80 acres of land that I didn't know I owned." Lyle stared at the money, then at Paul, then at the money again. His face had gone pale. "That's not possible." "It's possible." Paul pulled out the deed and unfolded it. "Ernst Kaufmann sold this land to my father 54 years ago. It was never recorded, nobody knew about it except my father, and now me." The other men in the dealership had gathered around, staring at the contents of the box. The jokes had stopped. The laughter had stopped. Everyone was looking at Paul Einhorn with expressions that ranged from disbelief to something that might have been shame. "You dug for 2.5 years, one of them said. "I did, and you found it." "I did." Lyle sat down heavily in his chair. "Paul, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything, Lyle. You said plenty over the past 2 years." Paul closed the metal box. "I just wanted you to see it. I wanted everyone to see it." He turned and walked out of the dealership, leaving silence behind him. Let me tell you about what happened next, because the treasure was just the beginning. The $12,000 in 1943 was worth significantly more in 1975, roughly $50,000 in purchasing power, accounting for inflation. But more valuable than the cash was the land. The 80 acres north of the Einhorn property had been sitting unclaimed for 34 years. The original seller, Ernst Kaufmann, had died in His heirs had long since scattered. The county records showed the land as belonging to Kaufmann's estate, but there was no estate to claim it. Paul hired a lawyer and spent 3 months proving that his father's deed was legitimate. The lawyer found records of the original sale, a handwritten receipt in the Kaufmann family papers, confirming that Herman Einhorn had paid $1,800 cash for the property in 1941. In August of 1975, Paul Einhorn officially took possession of 80 acres that had been his family's secret for 34 years. He now owned 280 acres, all paid for, all debt-free, and he had $50,000 in the bank. Let me tell you about how Paul used the money, because that's what made his father proud. Most men in Paul's position would have expanded, would have bought new equipment, new land, new everything. The 1970s were boom times for farming. Prices were high, credit was easy, and everyone was getting bigger. Paul did none of that. He put the money in a savings account and left it there. He farmed his 280 acres the same way his father had farmed, 200 carefully, conservatively, without debt. He bought new equipment only when the old equipment couldn't be fixed. He hired help only when he couldn't do the work himself. Your father left you a fortune, Martha said one night. "Aren't you going to use it?" "I am using it," Paul replied. "I'm using it as insurance. That money is for when we truly need it, just like Dad said. But we needed it. That's why you dug it up." Paul shook his head. "I dug it up because I needed to know if it was real. But we don't need the money yet. We're doing fine. The money is for when things go wrong." Martha looked at her husband, this stubborn, patient man who had dug for 2.5 years on faith, and she understood. "You're waiting for something. I'm waiting for whatever comes next. Dad buried that money because he didn't trust the good times to last. Neither do I. Now let me tell you about 1984, because that's when Paul's patience paid off. The farm crisis hit Nebraska like a hammer. Interest rates spiked. Commodity prices collapsed. Land values crashed. Farmers who had borrowed to expand found themselves underwater, owing more than their assets were worth. Paul Einhorn's neighbors were among them. Lyle Drucker's dealership closed in He'd extended credit to half the farmers in the county, and half of them couldn't pay. The man who had laughed at treasure hunter Paul was now bankrupt and looking for work. The farms around Paul started going to auction. Families who had worked the land for generations were losing everything because they had trusted the good times to last and borrowed against a future that never arrived. Paul went to those auctions. He didn't gloat. He didn't remind anyone of how they'd laughed at him. He just raised his hand and bid. By 1986, Paul Einhorn owned 480 acres, his original 200, the 80 his father had secretly purchased, and another 200 bought from neighbors at foreclosure prices. He paid cash for all of it. The money his father had buried in 1943 had grown, in the bank for 11 years. Combined with Paul's savings from a decade of careful farming, it was enough to buy security when everyone else was drowning in debt. "Your father was a smart man," Martha said, watching Paul sign the paperwork for his latest purchase. "He was scared," Paul replied. "Scared of what could happen when people trust institutions more than they trust themselves. He buried that money because he'd lived through the Depression, through the Dust Bowl, through the war. He knew that good times don't last, but you didn't live through those things. How did you know to wait?" Paul thought about it. "I guess I trusted him, even when everyone said I was crazy, even when I was digging in that hole for 2.5 years with nothing to show for it." He smiled. "Dad told me to use the money only when I truly needed it. I figured he knew better than I did when that would be." Let me tell you about Lyle Drucker, because his story has an ending too. In 1987, Paul heard that Lyle was working at a farm supply store in Grand Island, a 62-year-old man stocking shelves and answering questions about products he used to sell on credit. Paul drove to Grand Island and found him. Lyle looked up from the fertilizer display he was organizing. His face went red. "Paul, I heard you've done well." "I've done okay. More than okay. From what I hear, 480 acres, all paid for." Lyle tried to smile, but it came out wrong. "I guess I was wrong about that treasure map." "You were wrong about a lot of things." Lyle flinched. I know I was." He looked down at his hands, soft hands that had never done real work. "I'm sorry, Paul, for laughing at you, for telling everyone, for—" He trailed off. Paul was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised them both. "My father left me more than money, Lyle. He left me a lesson. He taught me not to trust people who laugh at things they don't understand." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, a business card. "I'm looking for someone to manage equipment sales for my operation. It's not a big job, but it's steady work. You interested?" Lyle stared at the card. "You're offering me a job? After everything I said?" "I'm offering you a chance. Same as my father offered me when he drew that map." Paul shrugged. "What you do with it is up to you." He walked out of the store, leaving Lyle holding the business card, tears running down his weathered face. Let me tell you about the map, because that's where this story ends. Paul Einhorn died in 2008, at the age of 64. He'd worked his farm until the last year of his life, just like his father before him. The 480 acres passed to his son Herman, named after the grandfather who had buried a fortune in faith and fear. But the map didn't go to Herman. Paul left it to the Franklin County Historical Society, along with the metal box and a copy of his father's letter. The exhibit opened in 2009. It includes the yellowed map, the rusted box, the original bundles of cash, now replaced with replicas. The real money stayed in the family, and the deed to 80 acres that sat unclaimed for 34 years. The placard beside the exhibit reads, "The Einhorn Map, a father's faith, a son's determination." In 1943, Herman Einhorn buried $12,000 and a secret land deed in his north pasture, leaving only a hand-drawn map for his son to find. For 32 years, the treasure lay hidden. Then, in 1972, Paul Einhorn found the map in his father's toolbox and spent 2.5 years digging while his neighbors laughed. On April 12, 1975, Paul's shovel struck metal. The treasure was real. This exhibit reminds us that faith sometimes looks like foolishness, and that the ones who laugh loudest are often the ones who understand least. Every year, on April 12th, the Einhorn family gathers at the museum for a private viewing. They tell the story to the youngest generation, how great-grandfather Herman buried his savings because he didn't trust the banks, how grandfather Paul dug for years while everyone mocked him, how the family survived the 1980s farm crisis because of money hidden in the ground for 40 years. The lesson is always the same. Trust the people who came before you. They knew things you don't. They saw things you haven't. And sometimes they leave you treasures that take years of faith to find. Paul Einhorn dug for 2.5 years on nothing but a yellowed map and his father's promise. Everyone laughed. He kept digging. And 6 feet down, in that Nebraska pasture, he found exactly what his father said he would find. That's the power of faith. That's the legacy of patience. That's what happens when you trust your father, even when the whole world says you're crazy.